matter of the inheritance is still unresolved.
My solicitor assures me it will be settled by the quarter sessions.
London learned of her disgrace before it learned her name. In drawing rooms warmed by coal fires and judgment alike, her fate was discussed with the careless intimacy reserved for women whose futures were no longer considered their own. Fans paused mid-flutter, teacups hovered, and voices softened not from mercy, but from delight. A match had been made for the younger Miss Everleigh, and it was whispered with a thrill usually saved for calamity. She was to marry the Duke of Ashcombe, the savage duke, who had not bowed at court in years, and whose silence was rumored to conceal a temper sharpened by war. Eliza Everleigh heard none of this directly. She encountered it as a pressure in the air, a thinning of smiles, an abrupt politeness that dismissed her as one already removed from society. Her stepsister, Charlotte, presided over these rooms with practiced grace, receiving condolences disguised as congratulations. Charlotte spoke of duty and advantage, of how fortunate Eliza was to be chosen by a man of rank. She did not speak of consent. Eliza, standing beside her, felt the peculiar loneliness of being visible yet unheard, a figure already framed by another's ambition. The Duke himself was known only through fragments. He had returned from the peninsula, with scars the newspapers would not describe, and a pension he refused to acknowledge. He kept to his northern estate, neglected invitations, and dismissed intermediaries with letters so brief they bordered on insult. London concluded what it always did, that absence implied barbarity, that reserve concealed cruelty. By the time Eliza's name was attached to his, the story was complete without either of them. Her childhood had trained her for this quiet endurance. She had learned early to make herself small, to observe rather than interrupt, to find refuge in books and hedgerows, while Charlotte learned the choreography of triumph. Eliza's mother had left her a gentleness that was not weakness, though the world mistook it as such. When the proposal arrived, carried by a solicitor who spoke of settlements and lineage, Eliza listened without protest. She asked only whether refusal was possible. Charlotte's smile answered before the man did. The wedding took place on a morning that could not decide between rain and light. The church was cold, its stones indifferent to the lives sworn within. Few attended. The Duke arrived without flourish, tall and plainly dressed, his posture precise, as if shaped by discipline rather than vanity. He did not smile, but neither did he scowl. His gaze met Eliza's once, briefly, with an attention that startled her more than any rumored ferocity. When he spoke his vows, his voice was low, steady, and unadorned, as though truth required no ornament. Afterward, there was no lingering, no celebration engineered for gossip. Charlotte kissed Eliza's cheek with a tenderness perfected for witnesses, whispering that everything would be well now. Eliza felt the words settle like a closing door. She left London in a carriage whose velvet seats bore the weight of finality. As streets gave way to hedges and then to open road, she allowed herself one silent grief for the life she had not been permitted to choose. The Duke rode ahead for a time, then fell back when the road narrowed. He asked, with careful courtesy, whether she was warm enough. It was the first question anyone had addressed to her that day, without expectation. She answered honestly. He nodded, as if storing the fact. They traveled mostly in silence, yet it was not the silence of threat. It felt instead like a space deliberately kept, an acknowledgment that strangers bound by law might still deserve restraint. By dusk, the land rose and the air sharpened. Ashcombe appeared through thinning mist, its stone face austere, its windows dark with history. Eliza felt fear then, not of the man beside her, but of the stories she carried like borrowed burdens. The Duke dismounted and offered his hand with a formality that stopped just short of distance. As she stepped down, her glove brushed his sleeve, and she sensed in him not savagery, but a gravity shaped by long-held sorrow. Inside, the house breathed quietly, as though unused to being observed. Servants moved with respectful efficiency. The Duke spoke to them plainly, without condescension or warmth, and they responded with something that resembled trust. He led Eliza not to a grand chamber, but to a smaller room overlooking a garden gone half wild. He said it would be hers, if she wished. The choice, modest as it was, felt radical. That night alone, Eliza stood at the window and watched moonlight gather on untamed branches. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. She understood then that the savage Duke was a story told by those who had never waited in such silence, and that her marriage, forged in cruelty, might yet conceal a different truth, one that would demand courage she had never been asked to claim. Sleep came slowly, broken by the unfamiliar creaks of an old house adjusting to night. Eliza lay awake, listening, her thoughts returning to the look that had crossed the Duke's face when he thought himself unobserved, a flicker of vigilance, not menace, as though he guarded something fragile within himself. She realized that London's whispers had given her a monster because it required one, because fear was more entertaining than patience. Here, in this quiet stronghold far from chandeliers and judgment, she sensed the beginning of a different contest, one not of wills, but of understanding. Duty had brought her across this threshold, yet duty alone could not explain the steadiness in his manner, nor the careful distance that felt like respect. Tomorrow, they would speak again, perhaps of trivialities, perhaps of nothing at all. But tonight, as the moon traced pale paths across stone, Eliza felt the first subtle shift of her fate, a tremor beneath resignation, hinting that what had been forced upon her might, in time, ask something braver than endurance. Days passed within Ashcombe's walls, measured more by the subtle shifts of light through tall windows than by the ticking of clocks. Eliza learned the rhythms of the estate as one might learn the language of a secret country, each corridor a sentence, each staircase a paragraph, each door a phrase whose meaning revealed itself only to those who lingered patiently. The servants, discreetly attentive, moved with a grace that suggested both pride and caution. The house itself seemed to observe her, its walls heavy with memory, the fireplaces cold yet dignified, and the portraits of long-departed dukes watching with unblinking eyes. Here, in these stone halls, the world of London, the world of gossip and ambition, felt impossibly far away, and yet its shadow followed her like a persistent wind at her back. The Duke, ever precise, maintained his distance, yet the distance itself carried a peculiar intimacy. He spoke rarely, choosing his words with the care of a man who had once measured lives in battle. When he addressed her, it was not with indulgence, but with attentiveness. In the mornings, he would glance toward the window, noting the direction of light, and ask if she required warmth, or whether the room's air suited her. His gestures were small but deliberate, a folded letter placed where she could find it, a cup of tea brought without a word, the adjustment of a chair so she might sit without strain. Each act was unadorned, yet in them lay a consideration far deeper than the courtesies of polite society. Eliza found herself drawn to the library, a vast room lined with tomes whose leather spines bore the scent of generations. There she discovered the Duke in private, often standing by a window, reading by natural light, or pacing softly as though the room's silence required it. Occasionally, he would speak of history, of battles not for glory but for survival, of men who returned from war with more than medals, scarred bodies, scarred minds, and the burden of witnessing lives snuffed out before their own. She listened, silent at first, absorbing the gravity of his experience. Slowly, she began to speak, offering observations on literature or nature, small threads of conversation that he did not unravel, but rather wove into his own contemplations. Evenings brought a peculiar intimacy. They would walk through gardens shadowed by the moon, gravel crunching beneath boots and skirts, dew scenting the air with freshness and melancholy. Words were few. Sometimes a glance or the simple acknowledgment of the other's presence sufficed. On one such night, the Duke paused near a fountain, the water catching moonlight in restless silver. He asked, in a voice both gentle and measured, what she had missed most in London. Her reply was cautious, mentioning sunlight and hedgerows, the laughter of children in the square, the warmth of a fire shared with family. He nodded as if he understood, though the depth of his expression remained unreadable, a mirror of both interest and restraint. It was during these quiet walks that the first hints of scandal reached the estate. Letters arrived from solicitors and distant relatives, delivered by postman or courier, always with a tone of urgent concern. They spoke of inheritance disputes, of questions surrounding her legitimacy as Duchess, and of insinuations about her stepsister's ambitions. Society, it seemed, could not resist intruding even on this remote sanctuary. Eliza read the letters in the solitude of her chamber, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of awareness that her private life, intended for reflection and adjustment, could be invaded by rumors and legal maneuvering, and that her own voice was powerless against the machinery of reputation. Yet the Duke's reaction was measured. He did not rage or storm, nor did he dismiss the letters lightly. Instead, he examined each one with deliberate calm, replying only where necessary, and always with a tone that sought resolution rather than spectacle. To Eliza, this revealed more than any conversation could. A man shaped by responsibility, whose stern exterior was not cruelty but self-control, whose capacity for patience exceeded even her own. In witnessing him, she understood that fear had been misattributed. The savage was savage only to the superficial judgments of society, but at home, he was precise, careful, and morally uncompromising. In the quiet of shared evenings, they began to exchange small confidences. One night, she asked why he had so completely withdrawn from London circles. His answer was careful, weighted with experience. He spoke of the toll of war, the loss of companions, and the superficiality of courtly life. There was no bitterness, only a resolute acknowledgment that public life demanded compromises he could not honor. In that conversation, Eliza sensed a vulnerability hidden beneath the layers of discipline and reputation. She, too, had been forced to navigate a world of expectation, and in recognizing his solitude, she felt a tentative kinship. Gifts emerged not in gold or silk, but in attentions and permissions. The Duke restored sections of the garden at her suggestion, leaving her a quiet alcove of roses and ivy. He permitted her unrestricted access to his library, to books previously sealed behind keys. He listened to her readings aloud, sometimes commenting with soft insight, sometimes merely observing, but always allowing her presence to exist without imposition. Each gesture, unremarkable in outward form, carried significance, a quiet acknowledgment of her dignity and agency within the walls of Ashcombe. The most profound shift occurred on a rainy evening, when the sky's sorrow mirrored the soft tension in the house. The rain pattered against the stone roof, a persistent percussion, and the firelight cast flickering shadows upon the walls. The Duke found her seated with an open book, her fingers tracing the lines of text without reading aloud. He spoke then, not in formality but in measured honesty, revealing fragments of his life, the exhaustion of command, the faces he could not forget, the moments when courage was demanded at the expense of desire. She listened, her own heart attentive, feeling for the first time that the man beside her was more than rumor, more than duty, more than society's cruel labels. The night stretched, measured in the cadence of rain and whispered words. When the conversation drew to a close, silence returned, yet it was not the absence of connection. It was a silence pregnant with understanding, with acknowledgement, with the slow recognition that the boundary between obligation and affection might, over time, dissolve. Eliza sensed the possibility of a partnership that transcended the constraints of gossip and expectation, a companionship rooted not in public approval, but in private truth. As the storm subsided, the first light of dawn crept through the high windows, illuminating the estate in pale gray. She rose and approached the garden door, breathing in the damp earth and the scent of moss and roses. Somewhere beyond the walls, London continued its whispering, indifferent to the quiet triumphs within. The Duke joined her without ceremony, offering no hand, no words, only the shared acknowledgement of presence. In that mutual silence, she felt an unspoken promise, a tentative trust forming between them. Duty had brought her here, respect had made her stay, and in the shadowed light of early morning, she realized that her heart might follow. Yet even as hope stirred, a letter left unanswered on the desk, stamped with the seal of her stepsister, hinted at turbulence to come, a reminder that outside scrutiny would not relent, and that love, however tender, must contend with the relentless pressures of the world beyond Ashcombe. The first frost of winter coated Ashcombe's gardens in silver, transforming hedges and flower beds into sculptures of ice, and yet the estate did not feel cold to those within its walls. Eliza moved through the corridors with a confidence born of weeks of careful observation, her presence no longer tentative, but quietly assertive. The Duke, ever watchful, allowed her this autonomy, noting her ease without comment, though his eyes lingered longer than before. London's whispers had grown louder, fueled by rumors of her supposed fragility and the inaccessibility of the savage Duke. Invitations arrived addressed to her alone, laden with expectation and judgment, yet she did not read them in haste. Instead, she placed them on the mantel, observing the way sunlight caught the gold lettering, and felt the first stirrings of amusement at society's assumption that she would cower beneath scrutiny. The Duke's demeanor had shifted subtly, imperceptibly to the outside observer, yet undeniable to Eliza. He moved with the same precision, the same measured reserve, but there was now a softness in his attention. He lingered when she entered a room, offering silent acknowledgment rather than formality. He provided counsel when asked, no longer withholding as though speech itself were a burden. Their conversations, once cautious exchanges of observation, had grown into dialogues of substance. They discussed books with an intimacy that required trust, debated ideas with restrained passion, and shared reflections on solitude and duty that neither had voiced aloud before. The estate, with its ancient stones and echoing halls, had become a vessel for their quiet companionship, its walls bearing witness to the slow unraveling of fear and the emergence of mutual regard. One evening, as twilight bled through high windows and the hearth fire painted the walls in amber, a messenger arrived with a letter that demanded attention. It bore the seal of London, the handwriting precise and familiar Charlotte's. The stepsister's intentions were unmistakable. She questioned the legitimacy of Eliza's position, hinting at claims against the Duke's estate and suggesting improprieties in their marriage. Eliza's hands trembled, not from fear of confrontation, but from recognition of the stakes at play. The Duke took the letter from her with deliberate calm, breaking the seal with a practiced hand. He read it silently, his expression unreadable, before placing it aside. There was no anger, no scorn, only a measured determination that reassured her more than words could. In that moment, Eliza realized that his strength was not in force but in moral certainty, a forceful steadiness that could withstand scandal without shattering. The following days were a careful dance of preparation and attention. Letters were drafted and dispatched, legal matters consulted upon, and yet throughout the strain, the Duke preserved their private rhythm. They walked in the gardens at dawn, boots crunching frost-laden gravel, speaking of trivial matters at first, the orientation of the greenhouse, the condition of the fountains. But gradually, their dialogue deepened. He asked her about her childhood memories, her unspoken hopes, the small kindnesses she cherished. She spoke freely, encouraged by the patience in his gaze, and he listened without interruption, absorbing her words as though they were precious relics. Each walk, each exchange, became a subtle act of defiance against the pressures of a society that sought to define them, a quiet affirmation that their marriage could not be dictated by whispers alone. One afternoon, amidst the stark elegance of the library, the Duke presented a gift not of jewels, but of access, a collection of letters and journals chronicling the estate's history. He explained in his low, measured voice that she was now entrusted with its care, to understand not only the walls and gardens, but the lineage, the choices, and the burdens that had shaped him. The gesture, understated yet profound, communicated more than any declaration could. Eliza accepted the gift with reverent hands, aware that it represented a trust extended beyond convention, an invitation to participate fully in a life previously closed to her. She felt a warmth that was neither sudden nor fleeting, but quietly enduring, a recognition that love, like the frost-coated gardens, could bloom under restraint. Scandal persisted beyond the estate's walls, carried by letters, visitors, and the insinuations of distant relatives. Yet with each challenge, the Duke's response reinforced his character. He confronted accusations with composure, defended her quietly but firmly, and never allowed the discord to reach their private sphere more than necessary. Eliza observed him and felt admiration deepen into something more, something tender and deliberate. He had never sought to charm her with grand gestures or poetic flourishes. Instead, he offered constancy, reliability, and respect, proving that true affection could grow in the spaces between restraint and duty. Her own heart responded, not with desperation or urgency, but with steady acknowledgement of the depth forming between them. The turning point arrived on a night when the sky was heavy with rain, the heavens drumming a relentless rhythm upon the estate. Eliza found the Duke by the conservatory window, gazing at the storm as though measuring its persistence against his own memories. She approached cautiously, expecting distance, yet he gestured to the seat beside him without a word. They sat in companionable silence, the patter of rain punctuating the quiet. Then softly he spoke of loss, not as a complaint, but as testament. Comrades fallen in distant wars, trust betrayed in politics, the relentless solitude that had defined his life for years. His voice was steady, but the weight of his experience was evident. Eliza, moved by the honesty and vulnerability, shared her own quiet trials, the compromises forced upon her by society, the long shadows of her stepsister's ambitions. Words flowed between them, neither grand nor flamboyant, yet each carried the weight of revelation. In that moment, their union, forged initially from obligation, began to reveal its deeper potential. As the storm waned, the first pale light of dawn illuminated the garden beyond the conservatory, revealing frost-laden blooms glistening like crystal. The Duke rose, offering no hand but a shared glance that conveyed understanding and respect. Eliza felt a surge of hope, tempered by the awareness of the world beyond Ashcombe's walls, where gossip and ambition still lingered. Yet in the quiet of that dawn, she recognized the transformation that had begun. Two lives intertwined not by coercion but by choice, not by fear but by mutual recognition. The estate, once imposing and silent, now seemed to breathe with possibility, its vast rooms and winding corridors filled with unspoken promises. Even as they parted, returning to their respective routines, a letter lay unopened on her desk, bearing the unmistakable seal of London. Its presence was a reminder that the world beyond,